The sun streamed through the tall windows of a well-kept suburban home, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden floors. Ethan Carter, a 35-year-old software engineer, sat at the kitchen table nursing his coffee. The scent of roasted beans lingered in the air, but the usual comfort of his morning ritual felt hollow. Across from him, his wife, Julia, was scrolling through her phone, her brows furrowed in concentration. Ethan stole a glance at her, the woman he'd fallen in love with a decade ago. She still looked stunning, her chestnut hair falling effortlessly over her shoulders and her sharp green eyes focused on the screen. But something was different lately. He couldn't pinpoint when it started, but there was a distance between them that had grown too vast to ignore. "Busy day ahead?" Ethan asked, forcing a casual tone. Julia glanced up briefly, her lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, back-to-back meetings. You know how it is." Ethan nodded, though he didn't. Julia worked as a project manager at a high-profile marketing firm, and her work life had always been demanding. But over the past 6 months, her job had begun consuming her entirely. Late nights, weekend calls, sudden work trips. None of it was new in their marriage, but the frequency had spiked alarmingly. Ethan had always prided himself on being a supportive husband, someone who encouraged Julia to chase her career ambitions. But lately, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There were the hushed phone calls she took in the next room, the sudden need to password protect her devices, and the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne on her clothes some nights. He tried to convince himself it was paranoia. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was solid, or so he thought. Later that evening, Julia came home later than usual, her laughter echoing in the hallway as she ended a call. Ethan stood by the kitchen counter, his hands wet from washing dishes. "Who was that?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just Greg," Julia said without hesitation. Greg, her boss. The name had become a fixture in their conversations. Greg this, Greg that. Greg thought her ideas were brilliant. Greg had invited the team out for drinks. Greg believed in her potential. Ethan didn't know much about the man, only that he was the charismatic CEO of her firm and recently divorced. The way Julia spoke about him left Ethan uneasy, though he kept his concerns to himself. On Saturday morning, Ethan woke up to find Julia already dressed. She was rarely an early riser on weekends. "Where are you off to?" he asked, propping himself up on one elbow. "Work," she replied, avoiding his gaze as she grabbed her purse. "On a Saturday? Greg wants us to finalize some pitches before Monday. It's important." Ethan frowned. Julia had always been dedicated, but this level of commitment felt excessive. Still, he didn't argue. "Okay, don't work too hard." She leaned down to kiss his cheek, but it felt mechanical, routine gesture devoid of affection. As the door clicked shut behind her, Ethan stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Ethan decided to distract himself by cleaning the house. In the process, he stumbled across a shopping bag in Julia's closet. Inside was a sleek black dress, far more glamorous than anything she'd typically wear to work, along with a receipt for an expensive perfume he didn't recognize. The back of his neck prickled. Julia hadn't mentioned buying anything new. He tucked the bag back where he found it, his chest tightening. That evening, Julia returned home late again, her mood unusually upbeat. Ethan asked her about her day, but her responses were vague, her words brushing over details as if she didn't want him to probe too deeply. Ethan spent the night tossing and turning, his mind replaying the subtle changes in her behavior. He hated the gnawing suspicion, but couldn't shake it. The following week, Ethan decided to take a half-day off work, driven by a nagging urge he couldn't ignore. He parked his car outside Julia's office building and waited. Around 3 p.m., he saw her exit the building, laughing with Greg. Ethan's stomach churned as he watched them walk to a nearby cafe, their body language easy and familiar. Greg leaned in closer than necessary as Julia spoke, her smile wide and genuine, the kind of smile she hadn't given Ethan in weeks. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his chest pounding. Was he reading too much into this? Was it just a professional relationship? The doubts began to consume him, but he told himself he needed proof before jumping to conclusions. That night, Julia returned home exhausted. Ethan tried to act normal, masking the turmoil beneath the surface. "Dinner's ready," he said as she dropped her bag on the couch. She smiled, this time more genuinely. "Thanks. You're the best." But as they ate, Ethan couldn't bring himself to look her in the eye. The image of her and Greg at the cafe was burned into his mind, and for the first time, he felt a crack in the foundation of their marriage. Ethan couldn't shake the image of Julia and Greg from his mind. Over the next few days, the once minor cracks in their relationship became glaring fractures. Her frequent absences, her guarded phone, and her sudden interest in late-night team-building sessions all seemed to point to one conclusion. It was a rainy Thursday evening when Ethan noticed Julia's phone buzzing on the counter while she showered. He hesitated but ultimately glanced at the screen. A message preview read, "Can't wait for tomorrow. I'll pick you up at 8. Gee. Ethan's chest tightened. He had no plans for the next day, and Julia hadn't mentioned anything about going out. He resisted the urge to unlock her phone, convincing himself that jumping to conclusions without context would only make things worse. When Julia emerged from the shower, she casually grabbed her phone, her demeanor as calm as ever. Ethan tried to gauge her reaction, but she didn't flinch. "Anything exciting happening tomorrow?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Julia barely glanced up. "Just work stuff. Greg wants us to meet a potential client for dinner." Ethan nodded, forcing a smile, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. The following day, Ethan returned home from work earlier than usual. He planned to surprise Julia, perhaps even suggest a spontaneous date night. However, when he walked into their bedroom, he found her standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the same sleek black dress he'd found in her closet. "Wow," he said, genuinely startled by how stunning she looked. "What's the occasion?" Julia turned, startled. "Oh, it's for the dinner with Greg and the client. First impressions matter, right?" Ethan studied her face. Her smile seemed forced, her eyes darting away as if she couldn't meet his gaze. "You didn't tell me about this dinner earlier," he pressed, his voice steady but probing. "I guess it slipped my mind," she replied, brushing past him to grab her purse. "Don't wait up, okay? It might run late." Ethan stood frozen as she left, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoing in his ears. The mounting tension was becoming unbearable. Ethan confided in his closest friend, Mark, during a late-night drink at their favorite bar. "You think she's cheating?" Mark asked bluntly, swirling his beer. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but something doesn't feel right. She's different, distant. And her boss. He's always in the picture." Mark leaned back, his expression serious. "You need to find out for sure. This guessing game is going to drive you crazy." "How?" Ethan asked, the frustration evident in his tone. "It's not like I can just accuse her without proof." "Then get proof," Mark said firmly. "If she's being unfaithful, you deserve to know. And if she's not, at least you can stop torturing yourself." Ethan nodded, though the thought of spying on Julia made his stomach churn. The following week, Ethan decided to take Mark's advice. He started paying closer attention to Julia's routines, noting every inconsistency. On Tuesday, she claimed she had a late meeting, but when Ethan called her office, her colleague casually mentioned that everyone had left hours ago. On Friday, Ethan installed a basic tracking app on her phone, a move he hated himself for but couldn't justify not taking. That evening, while Julia was out for another supposed work dinner, Ethan checked the app. Her location pinged at a luxury hotel downtown. His breath hitched as he stared at the screen. He wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but deep down, he knew there wasn't. The next morning, Julia acted as if everything was normal. She sipped her coffee, scrolling through her phone, while Ethan sat across from her, his mind racing. "Did the dinner go well?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yeah, the client seemed impressed," Julia replied without looking up. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but he didn't. Instead, he decided to wait and gather irrefutable evidence. That evening, Ethan followed Julia under the guise of going out with Mark. He parked a discreet distance from the restaurant she had mentioned earlier but didn't see her car. Instead, her tracking app showed her at the same hotel as the night before. Ethan's heart pounded as he drove to the location. Parking across the street, he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He spotted Julia's car in the valet area, her unmistakable license plate staring back at him like a mocking grin. An hour passed before Ethan saw her emerge, laughing alongside Greg. She was leaning into him, her hand brushing his arm in a way that felt far too intimate. Ethan stepped out of the car, his pulse roaring in his ears. "Julia," he called, his voice sharp and unsteady. Julia froze mid-laugh, her eyes widening as she turned to face him. Greg's expression shifted from surprise to discomfort, and he took a cautious step back. "What the hell is going on?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising. Julia stammered, "Ethan, this isn't what it looks like." "Don't," Ethan snapped, his chest heaving. "Don't insult me by lying right to my face." Greg cleared his throat. "Maybe we should all calm down." "Stay out of this," Ethan shot back, glaring at him. The confrontation escalated quickly, with Julia fumbling through excuses that only made things worse. Finally, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. "You've been lying to me for months," he said, his voice breaking. "I trusted you, Julia. I loved you. Was that not enough?" Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny the accusations. Her silence was the only confirmation Ethan needed. The fallout from the confrontation was immediate. Ethan left their home that night, staying at Mark's apartment to avoid the unbearable tension. Word spread quickly through Julia's workplace, and Greg's reputation took a significant hit. Rumors of their affair began circulating, jeopardizing both their careers. Ethan, meanwhile, wrestled with conflicting emotions: anger, heartbreak, and a faint, lingering hope that maybe, somehow, their marriage could be salvaged. He sought advice from a therapist, trying to process the betrayal and decide his next steps. His sessions were filled with raw confessions of pain and doubt. "Do you think there's a way back from this?" Ethan asked during one session, his voice barely above a whisper. "That depends," the therapist replied gently. "Can you ever truly trust her again?" Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure if he could. The days following the confrontation outside the hotel were a blur for Ethan. His heartache was a constant weight on his chest, making even the simplest tasks feel insurmountable. He had moved out of the house, giving Julia the space she claimed she needed to figure things out. But deep down, Ethan knew the truth had already been laid bare, and there was no coming back from it. Still, a part of him yearned for absolute clarity, a moment that would erase the lingering doubts and force him to confront the full extent of her betrayal. Late one evening, Ethan received an unexpected call from a mutual acquaintance, Lisa, who worked in the same office as Julia. She hesitated before speaking, her voice low and cautious. "Ethan, I don't know if I should be telling you this, but I think you deserve to know," Lisa said. "There's been talk at the office about Julia and Greg. People have seen them leaving together late at night, and there's more. Greg's been under investigation for misusing company funds." "What does that have to do with Julia?" Ethan asked, his throat tightening. "There's evidence tying her to it. They've been using company money for personal trips, hotels, dinners, things like that." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "Are you sure?" Lisa sighed. "I've seen the receipts myself." "I'm sorry, Ethan. I thought you should hear it from someone who cares." As the call ended, Ethan sat in silence, the gravity of Lisa's words pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, Ethan decided to return to the house. He had barely spoken to Julia since their fight outside the hotel, but this time, he was determined to get answers. When he arrived, he found Julia sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mix of guilt and apprehension. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice steady but cold. Julia nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "I know," she said softly, but Ethan didn't sit. He remained standing, his arms crossed as he stared her down. "Are you going to tell me the truth this time? Or should I spell it out for you?" Julia flinched at the sharpness in his tone. "Ethan, Don't," he interrupted. "Don't try to sugarcoat it or make excuses. I know about the hotels. I know about the dinners. I even know about the company money Greg's been using. Were you a part of that too? Julia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. I never meant for it to go this far, she said, her voice trembling. That's not an answer, Ethan snapped, his voice rising. Did you know what he was doing? Did you help him cover it up? Julia buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. It started out innocent. He was just so supportive, so encouraging. I felt appreciated in a way I hadn't in a long time. And then things got out of hand. Ethan's jaw clenched. So you're admitting it? You slept with him? Julia hesitated, and in that moment, Ethan felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Yes, she whispered finally. But it wasn't just about that. I didn't plan for any of this to happen, Ethan. I swear. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. His vision blurred, his chest tightening as a wave of anger and heartbreak crashed over him. You didn't plan for it? He repeated, his voice shaking. You destroyed our marriage, Julia. You lied to me, betrayed me, and for what? For someone like Greg? Julia looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with remorse. I was unhappy, Ethan. I felt invisible in our marriage. You were always so busy, so preoccupied with work. Don't you dare blame this on me, Ethan interrupted, his voice a low growl. I've supported you through everything. I've been nothing but loyal, and this is how you repay me. Julia reached out, but Ethan stepped back, his hands clenched into fists. I gave you everything, Julia, and now I can't even look at you without feeling sick. The fallout extended beyond their marriage. The company's internal investigation into Greg's misconduct had reached its peak, and Julia's involvement couldn't be ignored. Both were suspended pending further review, their reputations in tatters. Greg, who had always seemed untouchable with his charm and charisma, was now facing public scrutiny. News of the affair spread quickly, and whispers about his questionable ethics made him the target of scorn among colleagues and clients alike. For Julia, the professional consequences were just as severe. Once seen as a rising star in her firm, she was now ostracized by coworkers and faced the possibility of losing her job entirely. Ethan spent the next few days in a haze, replaying the confrontation in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Julia's tearful confession or the sound of her voice breaking as she begged for forgiveness. But forgiveness felt impossible. One evening, he returned to the house to collect some of his belongings. Julia was there, waiting for him. Ethan, she began, her voice hesitant. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I want to fix this, if you'll let me. Ethan stared at her, his emotions a turbulent storm. You want to fix this? He asked bitterly. You can't fix what's already broken, Julia. This isn't just about the affair. It's about trust, and you destroyed that. Julia's eyes filled with tears again, but Ethan felt no sympathy this time. I can't do this anymore, he said quietly. I deserve better than lies and betrayal. With those words, he turned and walked out, leaving Julia standing alone in the empty house that once held their dreams. The days following Ethan's final confrontation with Julia were a whirlwind of emotions, grief, anger, and a hollow sense of betrayal that refused to leave him. Every corner of his apartment felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the home he once shared with Julia. Nights were the hardest. He would stare at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their marriage, searching for the signs he had missed. Ethan's family and friends rallied around him. Mark, ever the voice of reason, tried to encourage him to focus on rebuilding his life. You've got to let her go, Mark said over beers one evening. Staying angry won't change what happened. It'll only drag you down. But letting go felt impossible. Ethan wasn't just mourning the loss of Julia. He was mourning the life they had built together, the future he thought was certain. For Julia, the fallout was swift and brutal. News of her affair with Greg spread through the office like wildfire, and while Greg bore the brunt of the backlash, Julia wasn't spared. She was summoned to a disciplinary hearing, where her superiors laid out the evidence against her: personal expenses charged to company accounts, suspicious business trips, and inappropriate behavior with Greg. Though Julia insisted she hadn't been fully aware of Greg's actions, the scandal had already tarnished her reputation. By the end of the week, both Julia and Greg were terminated. The news hit Julia hard. Her career, once promising and full of potential, was now in shambles. At home, the isolation was even worse. Ethan's absence was a constant reminder of her mistakes. She tried reaching out to him several times, leaving voicemails and texts that went unanswered. One afternoon, Ethan returned to his apartment to find a handwritten letter in his mailbox. It was from Julia. "Ethan, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to say this. I made a terrible mistake, one I will regret for the rest of my life. I don't expect your forgiveness, and I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that what happened with Greg wasn't about you. It was about me, my insecurities, and my inability to appreciate the incredible man you are. Losing you has been the wake-up call I didn't realize I needed. I'm working on myself now, and I hope one day, when the pain isn't so fresh, you'll be able to look back and remember the good times we shared. I'll always love you. Julia." Ethan read the letter twice before folding it and setting it aside. Her words stirred something in him, not forgiveness, but a faint recognition of the woman he had once loved. With the marriage irreparably damaged, Ethan contacted a divorce lawyer. The process was straightforward, as neither he nor Julia contested the terms. They agreed to sell their house, splitting the proceeds equally, and Ethan let her keep a few sentimental items. Julia, for her part, cooperated fully, as if trying to atone for her actions. The divorce was finalized within months, marking the official end of their union. Ethan's therapist encouraged him to confront his feelings head-on. In one session, Ethan finally allowed himself to voice the full extent of his pain. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Maybe if I had paid more attention, she wouldn't have looked elsewhere." The therapist shook her head gently. "Infidelity is never about the betrayed partner, Ethan. It's about the choices of the person who strayed. You can't carry that burden. It's not yours to bear." Those words became a turning point for Ethan. Slowly, he began to shift his focus from what he had lost to what he could rebuild. Julia's life, too, had changed dramatically. Without her job or Ethan, she moved into a modest apartment and took up freelance work to make ends meet. Though Greg tried to rekindle their relationship, Julia rebuffed him, realizing that their affair had been built on lies and selfishness. She began attending therapy as well, confronting the choices that had led her down such a destructive path. The process was painful, but it gave her a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. Ethan found solace in unexpected places. One afternoon, he met Lisa, the mutual acquaintance who had tipped him off, at a coffee shop. Their conversation began with awkward small talk, but soon turned into a deep and honest discussion about betrayal, trust, and moving forward. "I'm sorry for how everything turned out," Lisa said, "but I think you're stronger than you realize." Her words stayed with Ethan. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. The scandal left its mark on everyone involved. Greg's career was effectively over, his reputation ruined beyond repair. Julia, while slowly rebuilding her life, carried the weight of her decisions and their consequences. But for Ethan, the experience became a catalyst for growth. He realized that the betrayal, while devastating, had also freed him from a relationship that no longer served him. It gave him the opportunity to rediscover himself and what he truly wanted in life. Months turned into a year, and with each passing day, Ethan found himself further removed from the pain that had once consumed him. Therapy sessions, journaling, and long conversations with close friends had helped him untangle the emotional knots left by Julia's betrayal. The divorce had been the closing of one chapter, but it was the start of a new one. Ethan threw himself into his work, earning a promotion that gave him both financial stability and a renewed sense of purpose. More importantly, he began pursuing hobbies he had long neglected: photography, hiking, and even cooking. One weekend, while exploring a local trail, Ethan paused to take in the view. The forest stretched out endlessly before him, the sound of birdsong and rustling leaves filling the air. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. This is what freedom feels like, he thought. Julia's life had taken a much different turn. The scandal with Greg had left her professional reputation in ruins, and finding steady work proved to be an uphill battle. Freelancing barely covered her expenses, and her once vibrant social circle had dwindled. Despite the hardships, Julia committed to self-improvement. Therapy became a cornerstone of her routine, helping her confront the patterns that had led to her choices. She enrolled in online courses to expand her skill set, hoping to rebuild her career from the ground up. Her relationship with Greg had ended shortly after their terminations. The fallout from their affair revealed his manipulative tendencies, and Julia realized that their connection had been more about escapism than genuine emotion. One evening, Ethan attended a networking event at a local art gallery. He had been reluctant to go, but Mark had insisted. "You never know who you'll meet," Mark had said with a grin. As Ethan browsed the exhibits, he spotted a familiar face across the room, Julia. She looked different, her once polished appearance replaced by a simpler, more understated style. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Finally, Julia approached him, her expression hesitant but sincere. "Ethan," she said softly. "Hi." "Hi," he replied, his tone neutral but not unkind. They talked briefly, exchanging updates on their lives. Julia apologized again, not in an attempt to rekindle anything, but to acknowledge the hurt she had caused. "I'm glad you're doing well," she said at last. "You deserve it." "So do you," Ethan replied, surprising himself with the truth of his words. As they parted ways, Ethan felt a sense of closure. He no longer saw Julia as the woman who had broken his heart, but as someone who, like him, was trying to find her way forward. Ethan's journey had taught him hard but valuable lessons about love and trust. He had learned that relationships, no matter how strong they seem, require constant care and communication. He had also come to understand that betrayal, while devastating, did not define him or his worth. One evening, as he sat on his balcony watching the sunset, Ethan reflected on how far he had come. He had rebuilt his life piece by piece, creating something stronger and more resilient than before. "Trust takes time," he thought, "but I won't let fear hold me back from finding it again." Ethan's newfound confidence extended to his personal life. He began dating again, cautiously but optimistically. On a crisp autumn morning, he met Clara, a kind and intelligent woman with a passion for art and travel. Their connection felt natural, unforced, and grounded in mutual respect. As their relationship grew, Ethan opened up about his past, sharing the pain and lessons of his journey. Clara listened without judgment, her empathy reaffirming his belief that love, though fragile, could also be a source of incredible strength. Meanwhile, Julia continued her own path of self-discovery. She eventually secured a job at a small marketing firm, far from the high-stakes corporate world she had once inhabited. The work was less glamorous, but it was honest, and it gave her a chance to start fresh. She stayed single, focusing on rebuilding her sense of self. In her quieter moments, she thought of Ethan, not with longing, but with gratitude. Their marriage, though marred by pain, had taught her invaluable lessons about accountability, communication, and self-worth. The ripple effects of the betrayal had shaped both Ethan and Julia in profound ways. For Ethan, it was a journey of healing and rediscovery, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could lead to growth. For Julia, it was a wake-up call that forced her to confront her flaws and take responsibility for her actions. In the end, their lives diverged, each finding a new path that reflected their growth. Ethan stood on the balcony one last time, watching the stars appear in the night sky. A warm breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. As he raised a glass of wine in quiet celebration of his journey, he whispered to himself, "To resilience, to love, and to the courage to start over,